If you've ever sat across from a doctor who just delivered the news that your cholesterol numbers have crept up, you probably know that particular feeling that follows. A little bit of worry, sure, but often something else too, a kind of quiet dread about what comes next. Because for decades, the standard advice around high cholesterol has often sounded like a punishment. Give up butter, give up red meat, give up cheese, eggs, your grandmother's recipes, basically anything that actually tastes good, and replace it all with bland, joyless food for the rest of your life. I want to tell you today that this picture is not only unnecessarily harsh, it's also, in many important ways, simply outdated and not well supported by where the actual science has landed. You genuinely can lower your cholesterol in a meaningful, lasting way without turning your relationship with food into a source of constant deprivation and misery. Today we're going to talk through exactly how, with real, practical, sustainable strategies that let you keep enjoying eating, because a health plan you can't actually stick with long-term isn't really much of a plan at all. I think it's worth naming something honestly, right at the start too, which is that food is rarely just fuel, especially as we get older. It's tied to memory, to culture, to the people we've shared meals with over a lifetime, to Sunday dinners and holiday traditions, and the specific way a certain dish was made by a parent or grandparent. When a doctor hands over a list of foods to avoid without acknowledging any of that, it's no wonder so many people feel a sense of loss alongside the health concern itself. My goal today is to help you protect your heart while still honoring what food actually means to you, because those two things are genuinely not in conflict nearly as often as the old, overly simplified advice would have you believe. Let's start with a bit of groundwork on what cholesterol actually is and why it matters, because I think understanding the mechanics here genuinely helps everything else make more sense and feel less like a set of arbitrary rules you're being asked to follow. Cholesterol is a waxy, fat-like substance that your body actually needs for several important functions, including building cell membranes, producing certain hormones, and making vitamin D. Your liver produces most of the cholesterol your body uses, and the rest comes from the food you eat. Cholesterol travels through your bloodstream attached to proteins, forming what are called lipoproteins, and the two you've probably heard mentioned most often are LDL, low-density lipoprotein, and HDL, high-density lipoprotein. LDL is often referred to as the harmful type, because when there's too much of it circulating in your blood, it can build up in the walls of your arteries, contributing to a process called atherosclerosis, where arteries become narrowed and less flexible, increasing the risk of heart attack and stroke over time. HDL, on the other hand, is often referred to as the beneficial type because it actually helps carry excess cholesterol away from your arteries and back to your liver for processing and removal, essentially acting like a cleanup crew. There's also a third number worth knowing: triglycerides, another type of fat in your blood, and elevated triglycerides, particularly alongside low HDL, are also associated with increased cardiovascular risk. When your doctor talks about managing your cholesterol, they're generally talking about lowering LDL and triglycerides while maintaining or raising HDL, and the goal of everything we're about to discuss is aimed squarely at shifting these numbers in the right direction. Now here's something I think deserves real emphasis right at the start, because it genuinely reframes how you might think about food and cholesterol going forward. For a long time, dietary advice focused heavily on avoiding foods that themselves contain cholesterol, eggs being the classic example. But research over the past couple of decades has shown that for most people, dietary cholesterol has a considerably smaller effect on blood cholesterol levels than saturated fat, and in particular, what's called dietary pattern overall. Your liver actually adjusts its own cholesterol production in response to how much you consume from food, meaning that for many people, eating cholesterol-containing foods in moderation doesn't move the needle on blood cholesterol nearly as much as once believed. What matters far more, according to current research, is the overall pattern of what you're eating, particularly your intake of saturated fat, trans fat, fiber, and specific plant compounds that actively help lower cholesterol, which is genuinely good news because it means the conversation shifts away from a rigid list of forbidden foods and towards something considerably more flexible and, frankly, more livable. So let's talk about the actual strategies, starting with the concept that I think should anchor everything else we discuss, and that's addition rather than elimination. Instead of thinking primarily about what you need to cut out of your diet, I want you to think about what you can actively add in, because many of the most effective cholesterol-lowering foods work by displacing less helpful choices somewhat naturally, simply because you're fuller and more satisfied, without requiring you to white-knuckle your way through cutting out foods you genuinely love. The first and probably most well-researched category here is soluble fiber, and I want to explain specifically why this particular type of fiber matters so much for cholesterol, because understanding the mechanism makes the recommendation considerably more compelling than just being told to eat more fiber in a vague general sense. Soluble fiber dissolves in water to form a gel-like substance in your digestive tract, and this gel actually binds to cholesterol-containing bile acids in your intestines, preventing them from being reabsorbed back into your bloodstream and instead carrying them out of your body. Since your liver uses cholesterol to produce these bile acids in the first place, when more of them are lost through this process, your liver has to pull more cholesterol out of your bloodstream to replace them, which directly lowers circulating LDL cholesterol levels. Research has found that eating around 5 to 10 grams of soluble fiber daily can lower LDL cholesterol by a meaningful amount, and some studies have found even greater benefits with higher intake. The good news is that soluble fiber comes from foods that are genuinely enjoyable and easy to work into your regular meals. Oats and oat bran are among the most well-studied sources, and a bowl of oatmeal, prepared the way we discussed in an earlier conversation about breakfast, with milk, topped with fruit and perhaps a few nuts, provides a meaningful amount of soluble fiber right at the start of your day. Beans and lentils are another excellent source, and these can be worked into soups, stews, chilies, salads, or even simply served as a side dish, offering both soluble fiber and quality plant protein. Apples, pears, and citrus fruits contain a specific soluble fiber called pectin, and these make for satisfying, naturally sweet snacks that support your cholesterol goals without feeling like a sacrifice at all. Barley is another excellent, if somewhat underused, source of soluble fiber, and it can be substituted for rice in many dishes or added to soups for a heartier, more filling texture. The genuinely encouraging thing here is that none of these foods require you to give up flavor or satisfaction. They simply ask you to include them somewhat regularly alongside the foods you already enjoy. A simple, practical way to think about reaching that 5 to 10 gram target without needing to obsessively track numbers is to aim for at least one meaningful source of soluble fiber at each meal. A serving of oatmeal at breakfast, a cup of lentil soup, or a side of beans at lunch, and a piece of fruit with the skin on as a snack or dessert can add up to a genuinely meaningful amount by the end of the day, almost without you having to think about it once the habit becomes established. It's also worth mentioning that increasing fiber intake gradually, rather than all at once, tends to be more comfortable for your digestive system, since a sudden large jump in fiber can cause temporary bloating or discomfort for some people, which usually settles within a week or two as your gut adjusts. The second strategy involves a category of plant compounds called sterols and stanols, which have a genuinely fascinating mechanism worth understanding. These compounds are structurally similar to cholesterol, similar enough that they compete with dietary cholesterol for absorption in your intestines, meaning that when sterols and stanols are present, less cholesterol actually gets absorbed into your bloodstream in the first place, with the excess simply passing through your digestive system instead. Research has found that consuming around 2 grams of plant sterols or stanols daily can lower LDL cholesterol by a meaningful percentage, and this effect has been consistently replicated across numerous studies. These compounds occur naturally in small amounts in vegetables, nuts, seeds, and vegetable oils, but many people find it easier to reach a meaningful daily amount through products specifically fortified with added sterols or stanols, which have become increasingly available in forms like certain margarine spreads, orange juices, and yogurt drinks specifically marketed for cholesterol support. If this is something you're interested in exploring, it's worth checking labels for products specifically fortified with plant sterols or stanols, and this can be a genuinely easy, low-effort addition to a routine you're already following, simply swapping your usual spread or morning juice for a fortified version. It's worth mentioning that these fortified products tend to work best when used consistently as part of your regular routine, since the cholesterol-lowering effect comes from steady, ongoing intake rather than occasional use, similar in that respect to how a medication needs to be taken consistently to maintain its effect. If you decide to try a sterol or stanol fortified product, giving it a genuine few weeks of regular use before evaluating whether it's making a difference for you, ideally with a follow-up cholesterol check with your doctor, tends to give a more accurate picture than judging its effect after just a few days. The third strategy centers on healthy fats, and this is where I really want to push back on the old, overly simplistic idea that all fat is the enemy, because the type of fat matters enormously more than the simple presence of fat in your diet. Monounsaturated and polyunsaturated fats, when they replace saturated and trans fats in your diet, have been consistently shown in research to improve cholesterol profiles, generally lowering LDL, while maintaining or even raising HDL. Olive oil is probably the most well-known source here, and there's genuinely robust research behind the Mediterranean dietary pattern, which relies heavily on olive oil as its primary fat source, showing meaningful benefits for cholesterol and overall cardiovascular health. Using olive oil for cooking, for salad dressings, or simply drizzled over vegetables or bread instead of butter is a simple, flavorful swap that most people find genuinely easy to enjoy rather than endure. Avocados, which we discussed in the context of breakfast, are another excellent source of monounsaturated fat, and research has specifically found that regularly including avocado in the diet, particularly when it replaces less healthy fat sources, is associated with improved LDL cholesterol levels. Nuts, including walnuts, almonds, and pistachios, provide a combination of monounsaturated and polyunsaturated fats, along with fiber and plant protein, and numerous studies have found that regular, moderate nut consumption is associated with meaningfully improved cholesterol profiles and reduced cardiovascular risk. Fatty fish, including salmon, mackerel, sardines, and trout, are rich in omega-3 fatty acids, a specific type of polyunsaturated fat that has been particularly studied for its ability to lower triglycerides and support overall heart health, and aiming for fatty fish a couple of times a week is a genuinely well-supported recommendation. If fish isn't something you grew up eating or simply isn't to your taste, ground flaxseed and chia seeds offer a plant-based source of a related omega-3 fatty acid, and sprinkling a spoonful over oatmeal, yogurt, or a salad is an easy, low-effort way to work this in without needing to develop a taste for fish you don't already enjoy. And if you do enjoy fish but find fresh fillets intimidating to cook or somewhat expensive, canned salmon or sardines are a genuinely excellent, affordable, and convenient alternative that provide the same beneficial fats, whether flaked into a salad, mixed with a bit of olive oil and lemon for a quick spread on whole grain crackers, or simply eaten straight from the can as a quick protein source. Now, what about the foods that are more directly associated with raising cholesterol, particularly saturated fat? Since this is where the more restrictive advice traditionally focuses, I want to approach this honestly and practically, because I don't think pretending saturated fat doesn't matter at all would be accurate or responsible, but I also want to help you think about this in a considerably more flexible, livable way than simply being told never again. Saturated fat is found predominantly in fatty cuts of red meat, full-fat dairy products, butter, and certain baked goods and fried foods, and consistently high intake has been associated with elevated LDL cholesterol in research. The key word here, though, is consistently high intake, meaning the pattern of your regular, everyday eating over weeks and months, rather than any single meal or occasional treat. This distinction genuinely matters because it means that enjoying a favorite dish that happens to be higher in saturated fat on a special occasion, a holiday meal, a birthday dinner, your grandmother's specific recipe that means something to you beyond just its nutritional content, is simply not going to meaningfully move your cholesterol numbers if the rest of your regular, everyday eating pattern leans toward the foods and swaps we've been discussing. A genuinely practical way to think about this is what some nutrition researchers describe as a roughly 80-20 approach, where the large majority of your regular everyday eating, that 80% or so, leans toward the fiber-rich, healthy fat-forward pattern we've discussed, while leaving genuine room for the remaining portion to include the foods you love that might be higher in saturated fat, enjoyed with real pleasure rather than guilt, rather than being treated as forbidden. This isn't a loophole or a way to avoid making real change. It's actually how sustainable, long-term dietary patterns tend to work best according to research on adherence, since diets that feel like constant deprivation tend to be abandoned within weeks or months, while more flexible approaches that still meaningfully shift the overall pattern tend to be maintained for years, which is ultimately what matters most for your actual cholesterol numbers and cardiovascular health over time. I find it helpful to think of this the way you might think about a household budget rather than a strict rulebook. You wouldn't necessarily eliminate every non-essential expense from your life forever, but you'd be thoughtful about your regular, recurring spending while still leaving room for the occasional splurge that genuinely matters to you. Your dietary pattern can work the same way. The recurring, everyday choices, what you reach for most days without a second thought, are where the real cumulative impact on your cholesterol lives, while the occasional special meal simply doesn't carry nearly the same weight, precisely because it's occasional rather than routine. There are some practical swaps within this framework that can make a meaningful difference without requiring you to give up entire categories of food you love. If you enjoy red meat regularly, choosing leaner cuts, trimming visible fat, and being mindful of portion size rather than eliminating red meat altogether can meaningfully reduce saturated fat intake while still letting you enjoy the food itself. If a recipe calls for butter, experimenting with olive oil in savory dishes where the flavor swap works well, while reserving butter for the dishes where its specific flavor genuinely matters to you, like a particular baked good or a favorite holiday recipe, lets you reduce overall saturated fat intake without eliminating butter from your life entirely. Choosing lower-fat dairy options for your everyday, regular consumption, your morning coffee, your regular yogurt, while still allowing yourself the occasional indulgence of full-fat cheese or ice cream when it's something you're genuinely craving and savoring, again reflects that same flexible, sustainable approach rather than an all-or-nothing mentality. I want to specifically address trans fats here too, because unlike saturated fat, where the research supports moderation rather than complete avoidance, trans fats are genuinely worth minimizing as much as possible, since research has consistently found them to be particularly harmful, both raising LDL cholesterol and lowering HDL cholesterol simultaneously, a combination that's especially unfavorable for cardiovascular health. Trans fats are found primarily in partially hydrogenated oils, which were historically used in many processed and packaged baked goods, certain margarines, and some fried fast foods, though regulatory changes in many countries over recent years have significantly reduced their presence in the food supply. Checking ingredient labels for the words partially hydrogenated oil and choosing to avoid products containing this ingredient when possible is a genuinely worthwhile habit, since this is one area where the research supports minimizing intake as much as practically possible rather than the more moderate, flexible approach that applies to saturated fat. Let's talk about a few specific foods that deserve particular mention because they combine several of the beneficial mechanisms we've discussed into one genuinely enjoyable package. Garlic has been studied for its potential cholesterol-lowering properties, with some research suggesting modest benefits, particularly for triglycerides, and it's an easy, flavorful addition to countless savory dishes you likely already enjoy. Green tea contains compounds called catechins that have been studied for potential modest benefits to cholesterol profiles, and swapping an occasional cup of coffee or a sugary beverage for green tea can be an easy, pleasant addition rather than a sacrifice. Dark chocolate, specifically varieties with a high cocoa content, generally 70% or higher, contains flavonoids that have been studied for cardiovascular benefits, and enjoying a small square regularly rather than a large amount infrequently can actually fit quite comfortably into a heart-healthy eating pattern, which I suspect might be genuinely welcome news for anyone who assumed chocolate was simply off the table entirely. Legumes deserve one more specific mention here too, beyond their soluble fiber content, since research on dietary patterns, particularly rich in beans, lentils, and chickpeas, has consistently found associations with improved cholesterol and reduced cardiovascular risk. If beans haven't traditionally been a large part of your regular cooking, starting with dishes you already know and simply working them in as an addition, a handful of chickpeas tossed into a familiar salad, black beans added to a soup you already make, or lentils simmered into a pasta sauce alongside or instead of some of the ground meat can be an easy way to build familiarity without requiring an entirely new set of recipes. I want to shift now to talking about factors beyond diet, because while food genuinely matters enormously for cholesterol management, it's not the entire picture, and I don't want to leave you with the impression that diet alone is the only lever available to you. Physical activity has a genuinely meaningful effect on cholesterol, particularly on raising HDL, the beneficial type, and research has found that regular aerobic exercise, the kind of brisk walking we discussed in an earlier conversation about walking routines, can improve cholesterol profiles even without significant dietary changes, though of course the combination of both tends to produce the best results. Aiming for at least 150 minutes of moderate activity per week, which breaks down to about 30 minutes most days, supports not just cardiovascular fitness broadly, but specifically contributes to healthier cholesterol numbers over time. Maintaining a healthy body weight, or working toward gradual, sustainable weight loss if you're currently carrying excess weight, particularly around the midsection, has been shown to meaningfully improve cholesterol profiles, sometimes independent of specific dietary composition, simply through the metabolic benefits that come with reaching a healthier weight. This doesn't require dramatic or rapid weight loss, and in fact, research generally supports gradual, sustainable weight loss as being more effective long-term and considerably easier to maintain than aggressive, restrictive approaches. Quitting smoking, if you currently smoke, is one of the most impactful things you can do for your cholesterol and overall cardiovascular health, since smoking has been shown to lower HDL cholesterol while also directly damaging blood vessels in ways that compound the effects of elevated LDL. The encouraging news here is that HDL levels often begin improving within weeks of quitting, providing relatively fast, tangible feedback that can be genuinely motivating during the challenging process of quitting. Limiting alcohol intake matters here too, particularly since excessive alcohol consumption is associated with elevated triglycerides, and as we discussed in an earlier conversation, the previously popular idea that moderate drinking, particularly red wine, offers meaningful cardiovascular protection has been increasingly called into question by more recent, rigorous research, suggesting that keeping alcohol intake modest rather than viewing it as an active health strategy, the more evidence-supported approach. I also want to genuinely emphasize the role of medication here, because I don't want anything in this conversation about natural dietary approaches to be interpreted as suggesting that medication isn't sometimes necessary or appropriate. For some people, particularly those with genetic factors contributing to high cholesterol, or those with other significant cardiovascular risk factors, lifestyle changes alone may not be sufficient to bring cholesterol into a healthy range, and medications like statins have decades of robust research behind them demonstrating genuine, significant reductions in heart attack and stroke risk. If your doctor has recommended medication alongside lifestyle changes, please don't view this as a failure or as evidence that the dietary approaches we've discussed today don't matter, since diet and medication work through different, often complementary mechanisms, and many people benefit most from a combined approach rather than choosing one over the other. The strategies we've discussed today can genuinely work alongside medication, often allowing for lower doses or providing additional cardiovascular benefits beyond what cholesterol numbers alone reflect. And this conversation about food is not meant to replace medical guidance, but rather to complement it. It's also worth having your cholesterol rechecked periodically, generally something your doctor will guide based on your particular situation, so that you can actually see in concrete numbers whether the changes you're making are having the effect you're hoping for. This kind of feedback can be genuinely motivating, turning what might otherwise feel like a vague, abstract effort into something you can track and take real pride in as the numbers move in a healthier direction over the months ahead. I want to spend a moment talking about how to actually implement all of this in a realistic, sustainable way, because I think the gap between knowing what's beneficial and actually building it into your regular life is often where good intentions tend to fall apart. Rather than trying to overhaul your entire diet overnight, which tends to feel overwhelming and rarely sticks long term, I'd encourage picking just a couple of the strategies we've discussed today and building them into your routine first. This might mean simply starting your day with oatmeal a few times a week instead of your previous breakfast choice, or switching your primary cooking oil from butter to olive oil for most savory dishes, while still keeping butter on hand for the occasions where it genuinely matters to you. Once that feels comfortable and automatic, typically after a few weeks, you can add another change. Perhaps working in fatty fish once or twice a week, or adding a handful of nuts as a regular snack. This gradual, additive approach tends to produce changes that actually stick, rather than an ambitious overhaul that feels unsustainable within a matter of weeks. I also want to encourage you to actually enjoy this process, rather than approaching it with a sense of grim obligation, because I genuinely believe that's part of what makes dietary change sustainable long term. Experimenting with new recipes that happen to be heart-healthy, trying a new bean-based soup, learning to make a genuinely flavorful salad dressing with olive oil, lemon, and herbs, or discovering that a piece of dark chocolate after dinner is both enjoyable and aligned with your health goals can turn this entire process into something considerably more like genuine culinary exploration than restriction. Many people find that after a few months of leaning into these kinds of foods more regularly, their taste preferences genuinely shift, and dishes that once seemed like the healthy alternative start to feel like simply what they actually prefer to eat, rather than something they're settling for. As we bring this conversation together, I want to leave you with a clear, encouraging picture of what managing your cholesterol naturally can genuinely look like. It's not a life of bland, joyless eating, counting every gram of fat with anxious precision, or mourning the loss of foods you love. It's building a pattern of regular eating that leans toward fiber-rich foods like oats, beans, and fruit that embraces healthy fats from olive oil, avocados, nuts, and fatty fish. That's mindful rather than fearful about saturated fat. And that leaves genuine room for the foods and dishes that bring you real joy and connect you to your history, your culture, and the people you love. Combine this with regular movement, maintaining a healthy weight, and working closely with your doctor on monitoring your numbers and considering medication when it's genuinely appropriate for your particular situation, and you have a genuinely comprehensive, sustainable, and honestly enjoyable approach to protecting your heart for the years ahead. Your cholesterol numbers matter, and taking them seriously matters, but taking care of your health was never meant to come at the cost of everything that makes eating a genuine pleasure in your life. With the right approach, you truly can have both.